Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. It is Short Story Tuesday, it's a wonderful day to talk about all the short form literature that has interested me, and it is still Black History Month, the final Black History Short Story Tuesday for the month of February, but do not worry, I have found a lot of other Black literature throughout this month that I'm going to be talking about throughout the year, so I am not limiting my discussion of Black writers and Black themes and stuff like that to just the month of February, which would be weird and dumb and stupid anyways, even though that's what a lot of other sort of mass media conglomerates kind of do, which is unfortunate. But today I want to talk about a short story that is all about colorism. I am referring to Sweetness by Toni Morrison, which was published in The New Yorker in 2015. For those who don't know, Toni Morrison is an American author, a Black American author, who lived between the 1930s and I believe 2017. She died pretty recently. Her work has primarily focused on racism, the Black experience in America, and colorism, as you see in this particular story, but I believe she's also gotten it written about in other stories that she's focused on. I've talked about Toni Morrison before, and when I talked about Beloved, a really solid book that really hit me pretty hard when I read it. And I very much look forward to reading more Toni Morrison in the future. I got to make some time for that because I'm pretty sure some of her other works are going to be even higher quality as well. But yeah, she talked about colorism and racism and all of that, which you see in the story that I'm going to be talking about today. What's important is that in addition to doing that, she was also a feminist or a womanist, as she called herself, which focused on Black women, whereas feminism has so often excluded Black women and their relationship to Black men. And what's also interesting is that this story came out in 2015, so it's one of the last things that she wrote before she died, in I think around 2017. So very interesting that this is her last real work, and it's something that's still raising awareness of discrimination. So working pretty hard, even though some people would have proclaimed at the time that we lived in a post-racial America, we clearly didn't, as what had come after 2015 showed that racism was still alive and well. But without further ado, let's talk about Sweetness. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Sweetness focuses on the character of Sweetness. We don't know her real name, but she just tells her daughter to call her Sweetness. And she's recalling her life with her daughter growing up in the racist South. I believe it's set anywhere between the late 1800s and the mid 1900s. It's a bit unclear what the chronology is there. But she's basically talking about how she gave birth to her daughter Lula Ann, and Lula Ann was dark-skinned in comparison to Sweetness, who is more lighter skinned. But they're both Black individuals, but there is that sort of color divide that is present in this family. Her Sweetness's husband is also shocked by this, and he ends up abandoning the family because he partially believes that Sweetness cheated on him. But Sweetness points out that either within her family background or his family background, there is a darker skinned family member who is the reason that Lula Ann is so dark, which Sweetness calls tar colored, which is the basis for another Toni Morrison story. But it's very alarming that anyone would describe their child's skin as tar colored, because you don't normally associate great things with tar. And thus, Sweetness is left to raise Lula Ann on her own. They develop something of a testy relationship, as Sweetness is trying to instill all the markers of Black adulthood and like the Black experience within Lula Ann and protect her. But she's also hiding her from the world because she feels a great deal of shame about Lula Ann and doesn't want Lula Ann sort of throwing a wrench into how she receives privileges in the world, because she's lighter skinned and some people aren't as discriminatory against her as they could be. And this ends up angering Lula Ann over time, as we can see as she begins fighting back when she becomes a teenager and arguing with her mother over quite a few things. And it gets to the point where once Lula Ann graduates, she ends up moving to California, where she starts a family and only writes letters back to Sweetness with no return address, so Lula Ann can't locate her or really communicate back with her. And Sweetness is left to basically be in a nursing home and deal with everything on her own. The only news that Sweetness really has is what we see at the end of the story, with Sweetness finding out that Lula Ann is pregnant. But as Sweetness points out, Lula Ann isn't telling Sweetness who the father is, indicating some of that shame might have been passed on. But Sweetness ultimately notes that Lula Ann is going to find out how hard it is to raise a child, and it sort of ends on that very downer note right there. In terms of analysis, racism. That's it. Goodbye, everybody. No. In terms of analysis, like Toni Morrison provides us with one big theme worth talking about in this short story. But it is a very powerful theme, and there's a bunch of nuance to it that I like that Toni Morrison does here. And that is of racism. There's differing degrees of racism in this story. You see, first and foremost, the Jim Crow sort of white systemic racism, where Sweetness has to worry about whether she's going to find a place to live. She's subject to the usual terrorism that poor whites usually inflicted upon Black individuals in the South. Specifically, Sweetness is worried that like she saw a young Black girl get kicked around by a bunch of white boys when she was walking through the neighborhood, and she's worried that might happen to Lula Ann. But she also sees some the usual Jim Crow separate but equal principles thrown around, including the fact that I think Sweetness's mother had to testify on a Bible that was explicitly for Black individuals, indicating that in this Southern society, the Black individuals aren't allowed to pray or worship the same white God that the white individuals do. So it's the usual racism that you see in the South during this time, and that continues to this day. Even though Jim Crow is gone, you still have people attempting to further this systematic oppression. But not only do you see this Jim Crow stuff, you also see a different layer, a different nuance, a different degree of this racism or discrimination, which is discrimination between Black individuals because of the color of your skin. Now, this is a whole separate sort of discussion, I think, and it's one that I don't feel I'm perfectly equipped to talk about, but I'm going to do my best here because I don't feel like I can police the light versus dark color sort of issue in being a white individual. But the idea is that there are certain privileges afforded to light-skinned dark Black individuals because they're able to pass in some cases. And so the white individuals don't throw the full weight of their racism and discrimination at them, whereas dark-skinned Black individuals face a great deal more, not only from white individuals, but from other light-skinned Black individuals, because it's that systemic oppression kind of being internalized, but also it's the please don't target me, target these other Black individuals because, I want the same rights that you do, and if you focus all your attention on the dark-skinned individuals, the light-skinned Black individuals might get more privileges and whatnot, which is unfortunately not really the case. But when you teach someone that they're not worthy in society, it's often internalized in some sort of way like that. So we see a lot of that colorism in the story because Sweetness does not like that Lula Ann is dark-skinned Black, and her husband even abandons her because partially because he feels that like he feels that like what am I trying to say? He feels that like sweetness cheated on him, but also it's the stubbornness to accept that someone in your past might have dark skin, and so now the life where these are two light-skinned black individuals is going to be interrupted by the fact that there's this reminder of this racism in society right there, and if you keep Lula Ann in close proximity to you, the white individuals will remember that you're in fact white or black. Sorry. And they will continue their discrimination against you, probably in harder force, because again, the dark, you have a clear example of a black individual in Lula Ann. So there's a bit of fear there. There's a bit of shame in that you're told to be ashamed that you're black in society, and so again, sweetness is internalizing that. What's worse is she kind of recognizes that, and she's trying to stop herself, but again, because a lot of this is internalized, you're not quite aware, or you're not 100% aware of how much you're doling out to other people. The oppressor has effectively made you part of the oppressive system in facilitating this light versus dark skin colorism. And ultimately, you do have to wonder what the effect is of this light skin versus dark skin sort of conundrum that Sweetness and Lula Ann are sort of facing. And unfortunately, I think the answer that Toni Morrison points out is that it's passed on because when Lula Ann tells Sweetness that she's pregnant, she doesn't say who the father is. She doesn't send any pictures, and she presumably she's not going to show Sweetness the child down the road. So is this colorism going to be furthered in some way? I think Toni Morrison is arguing that yes, it is, that it's passed on from generation to generation without complete awareness that is happening. Again, because it's internalized and it's a function of the system that people don't really think about. It's possible that Lula Ann's daughter is going to be light-skinned. In which case, I think there's still going to be a sense of shame and anger going on because Lula Ann is a dark-skinned individual, so she might not have the privileges that this light-skinned baby has, and this ability to pass, and it's going to create a whole trouble, wrench in their relationship. And it's possible that Lula Ann could have a dark-skinned child, and she's going to basically do the same thing that her mother did to her without realizing it. And so it does seem a bit like a real conundrum there. And unfortunately, Toni Morrison really isn't optimistic in the the potential for generational change. She's really calling awareness to something that needs to be addressed by all of Black society here. Morrison also goes on to talk about family struggles here. She touches a little bit on it. There's some commentary about the mother-daughter relationships and how because of all the stress that goes on between Lula Ann and Sweetness, that when Sweetness gets older, Lula Ann isn't really there for her. They can't really communicate, and when Lula Ann does send letters, she doesn't provide a return address. So it's sort of a one-way conversation that is a result of this troubled family relationship. And I do think there's a lot more worth discussing here, but unfortunately, Toni Morrison kind of rushes through that aspect of the story. I get that it's not really the focus, but I'm sure if Toni Morrison had developed this short story a little bit further, because it is kind of short, she would have been able to talk more about this mother-daughter relationship. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Sweetness by Toni Morrison. A solid short story, even though it's pretty short and that some of the ideas don't feel as well developed. The central idea of colorism within the Black community is something that's very important to talk about. And I don't feel like I'm the best person to have that discussion because I am not myself Black, and it's very weird for a white person to sort of police Black individuals in their own community given all the other systemic oppression that takes place. But it's still important to raise that awareness of this topic and talk about how the oppressor forces the Black individuals to create subgroups and to further lobby this oppression and this systemic racism. I do recommend that you go read it. There is a lot worth parsing through this story. I feel like you could pick it apart sentence by sentence and analyze it there. A lot that I probably haven't mentioned here and that I wasn't able to to pick apart, but I do think that there's more worth discussing here. If you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about sweetness. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this short story or this author if they don't already know about her. And again, I feel like a lot of people kind of do, but it's always good to get the Toni Morrison name out there even further. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and non-colorism travels. Farewell.